All right, welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're really getting into something I think is pretty cool,
Mhm.
music therapy. We've got a ton of material to go through, looking at how it all began,
Mm.
the history, how it actually works,
Yeah.
and then all these kind of unexpected ways that it can really truly help people. It's pretty amazing what we found.
Yeah, we're going to be exploring really the journey of music therapy, especially how it's grown in the UK. We'll dig into the main ideas behind it, and we'll uncover some of some of the surprising things that it offers.
Yeah, and the sources that we're drawing on, we got like discussions on the early days, some amazing stories from people working with kids and adults, and even some really interesting stuff about just sound and music in and of themselves. I mean, think about it. Our goal today is to like really get a good grasp on what music therapy is all about,
Yeah.
like beyond just listening to music for fun or to, chill out. So let's unpack this a bit. Where did it all start?
Well, if we zoom in on the UK, there's this key figure that stands out, Juliet Alvin. She's not just a musician, she was like a big deal, internationally known, a concert cellist, and a teacher too. And her work, it really paved the way.
Okay, so there are some like key moments, right, in the UK that kind of mark, important steps in how music therapy developed.
Totally. So 1958, that's when the Society for Music Therapy and Remedial Music, it was founded, which later on became the British Society for Music Therapy, or BSMT. And then just a few years later, you've got 1968. That's when Alvin, she led the very first music therapy course at, get this, the Guildhall School of Music and Drama in London. Then 1974, Paul Nordoff and Clive Robbins, they teach their first course at Goldie Lee Hospital. And then just a couple years later, 1976, the Association of Professional Music Therapists, that's APMT, gets established. So you can see those were some pretty big steps.
All right, so early days, where were music therapists actually working? Like in what kinds of settings?
Well, kind of like in the early years in the USA, a lot of them were in, large institutions, places that looked after adults with long-term issues, things like, very serious physical and mental disabilities, or chronic schizophrenia. Many of these folks, they'd been in those hospitals for years and years.
So it sounds like the thinking back then was, well, if you're in that kind of a situation, music's got to be good for you, right?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. At first, the idea of referring someone to music therapy was pretty simple. Like, let's just expose them to music with a, caring therapist, and it can't really hurt, right? Might even do some good. But as the whole field grew, there was this shift. People started wanting more specific reasons for these referrals. And music therapists, they began developing like real systematic ways to, assess and see what was actually happening.
So they were starting to really pinpoint where music therapy could be most effective, huh?
Right. Like they were working with people who had learning difficulties, and it became clearer that music therapy could actually help them, keep and even get better at, well, lots of things. We're talking physical coordination, their thinking skills, motivation, how they talked and understood language, nonverbal stuff, social skills, choosing and being independent. And then, in adult mental health, they saw improvements in moods, less tension, people being better at expressing their feelings. They got better at interacting in groups, and their self-esteem got a boost. It's kind of like music opened up this channel for connection and expression.
It's pretty remarkable how music becomes this way of, expressing and actually, kind of putting those feelings out there, almost like a stepping stone before you can put it into words.
Yeah, exactly. And it's super important to get this. Music therapy, it's not just learning an instrument or singing lessons. It's not even just like leisure time, although it can be really fun. And while sure there's an element of entertainment and it can be a nice distraction, that's not the main point. The big idea is that it's meant to be a part of like established therapy models.
So it's way more targeted than just, putting on a nice record or something. What about like the places music therapists work now in the UK? Has that changed much?
Oh, yeah, totally. It's so diverse now. We're talking hospitals, special units for both adults and children, dealing with all sorts of things, learning disabilities, physical disabilities, mental health challenges. Then you've got those early childhood assessment centers and nurseries, special schools, day centers, hospitals, and even residential homes for the elderly. And there are therapists working in centers for people with visual and hearing impairments, in the prison system, hospices, and even private practices.
Wow. So it seems like the understanding of who can actually benefit from music therapy, it's really expanded.
Oh, for sure. And while the core work with folks who have, serious communication difficulties is still going strong, therapists are increasingly involved in areas that, while they might not have been the main focus before, the field is really broadening its reach. And this shift, it brings up an important question. How did we move from those initial assumptions about music being generally helpful to this, much more evidence-based approach we see today?
That kind of naturally brings us to the whole, rise of research in music therapy,
Yeah,
right?
it does. The need for like solid research. It was highlighted back in '82. There was this survey. It looked at the first 13 volumes of the British Journal of Music Therapy, so the BJMT. That covered, let's see, from '68 to '82. And it's interesting because this survey was kind of like a mirror image of one done by Jellison in the US, which focused on the early publications of the National Association for Music Therapy. Kind of a similar story on both sides of the Atlantic.
So what did this, early look at the BGMT tell us about the kinds of articles they were putting out?
Right. So they basically divided the articles into three types. You had philosophical stuff, with all the analyzing and theories. Then there was historical, like reviews and summaries of, what had already been done. And then descriptive, which focused on the current state of music therapy, mainly through individual case studies.
So a lot of like theoretical talk and descriptions of what people were doing in practice.
Exactly. The survey found, this continued focus on descriptive and philosophical pieces. But what was really interesting was there wasn't much experimental material at all. And this was just like what Jellison found in those earlier U.S. publications, which makes you think that both countries were kind of at the same stage in terms of the field developing.
Yeah, that makes sense. To
Right.
really build a solid base of evidence, you need those experiments, right?
Absolutely. But there was this prediction back then that, more experimental work would start to pop up. This was linked to how the journal itself evolved. So in '87, the BJMT, it became a joint publication, between the Professional Association, APMT, and the British Society, the BSMT. And it was renamed the Journal of British Music Therapy, or JBMT. This was a pretty big deal, this collaboration.
So did that prediction actually pan out? Did the new journal actually start publishing more research articles?
It did. Another survey looked at those first 4 years of the fresh out the oven JBMT, and it showed that those experimental research pieces, they had climbed to the second spot, right alongside those philosophical ones. And the overall number of articles went up too during this initial phase of the JBMT. It really showed a growing commitment to like really solidifying the evidence behind the field.
That's a clear sign that the field was really getting serious about research.
Yeah.
So how did that compare with what was going on in the U.S.?
Well, interestingly, this analysis in the UK in '91, it showed a very similar pattern to a US study done back in '79 by Gilbert. Gilbert, he looked at how music therapy publications developed in the US from '52 to '78. And you know what? It turns out the UK from '68 to '91 followed a really similar path. This suggests that both countries went through similar stages, starting with that focus on theory and descriptions and then gradually moving towards more, you know, nitty-gritty empirical research. It's like they were on parallel tracks when it came to establishing music therapy as a, legit field.
It's really interesting to see those parallel journeys happening, across continents. So now that we have a sense of the history and how research grew, let's dig into what music therapy actually looks like in action. We've got these really interesting case studies.
Okay, yeah, let's look at this individual session with a young boy named John, the therapist here. She's communicating mostly without words, using sounds.
So it's not just like random noise, right? They're really focusing on the specific qualities of the sounds.
Right, exactly. The therapist is super tuned into like when and how John makes sounds, what kind of sounds, and how complex they are. And it seems like John, he was understanding what was going on and could follow, basic instructions.
It sounds like this music therapy session was helpful for like the other professionals who were involved with John's care too.
Yeah, absolutely. Like the speech and language therapist, they got more info about John's sound production, and how well he was understanding language. And the occupational therapist, they were watching how John interacted with the instruments, his creativity, how motivated he was to take part.
And the psychotherapist's perspective seems like it's really insightful. It really focuses on the emotional side of the session.
Totally. They were looking at whether John's music making was a genuine way for him to express feelings and, how using instruments and his voice helped him communicate those feelings. They also noticed the therapist's own emotional responses during the session, like feeling excited, being moved by John's expressions, and that growing sense of trust between them. There's even a note that John, he had tears in his eyes at one point when he was vocalizing. That kind of raw emotion, it can be incredibly meaningful in therapy.
Wow, that's a really powerful image. So what were the specific aims of this session with John?
Well, they wanted to create chances for, what's called synchronous and antiphonal play, basically
Yeah.
a musical back and forth, like a conversation through sound. And they wanted John to see that his music could actually, directly influence what the therapist did. They wanted him to get better at controlling his feelings and communicating those feelings without words, getting instant feedback through the music.
Let's switch gears now and look at that group session, the one on the acute admissions ward. Those are usually pretty intense places.
They are. This was a ward for short stays for people going through intense periods of, well, things like manic depressive psychosis and schizophrenia. So the therapist starts by setting up this basic pulse on a drum, like a heartbeat.
And it wasn't just a set rhythm, was it? They actually, checked in with the group about it.
Yeah, yeah. Some people thought it was a bit too fast, so the therapist adjusted it, slowed it down until it was comfortable. Then folks could join in, adding their own rhythms on different instruments. Some jumped right in, others took their time, and some decided not to play at all, which is totally fine. The music, it slowly built up in intensity and volume, kind of like a crescendo, reaching this peak.
Yeah.
And afterwards, they talked about how the different instruments sounded and how the rising volume felt, physically energizing.
Sounds like a really dynamic and engaging experience
Yeah.
for everyone there.
It was. So they switched up the instruments and went through the whole structure again, playing around with faster and slower tempos this time. People made comments about how exciting it was to play fast and how tricky it was to keep it slow and controlled. And it was interesting. The volume kind of followed the tempo naturally. Louder when faster, softer when slower.
And there's one person who had a really personal experience during this.
Yeah, one of the women, she said she felt self-conscious, preferred to play with her eyes closed. So they did the whole thing again, everyone closing their eyes, focusing on what they were hearing inside. The therapist thought this first part of the session gave people this sense of freedom, within a structured framework. They could do their own thing musically, but they were still connected by that underlying pulse. It's amazing how a structure can actually, create a safe space for exploration.
It's really interesting how that structure provides both freedom and security at the same time. And the source also talks about some key therapeutic factors in group music therapy, drawing on the work of Yalom.
Yeah, yeah. The first one is called installation of hope. Basically, at the beginning of any group therapy, you want to create this feeling of optimism and possibility. And in music therapy, knowing that there's no right or wrong way to play, it helps people relax about the instruments, encourages a playful curiosity, and, just giving them permission to explore in a safe environment. That's often the most important first step.
And as the group sessions go on, other important things come into play, like developing social skills.
For sure. Music making, it's often nonverbal, so it gives people so many chances to interact, to really listen, to imitate, and learn how to, relate to each other. Group members, they can test different ways of behaving, of interacting, all within this safe space of music. They find their own roles in the group, get more comfy connecting with others, and they learn that their own musical contribution, it adds something valuable to the whole group sound.
It's almost like the music becomes a mini version of social interaction in the real world.
Exactly. And the example we talked about before, it showed how group members started to show they cared for each other. The final improvisation was based on feelings that were shared in the group. This was a great example of how they could support each other, get new perspectives on their own problems by hearing what others were going through. It's funny, insights from fellow group members often go down easier than when they come straight from the therapist.
And there's this idea of what's called corrective recapitulation of the primary family group. That sounds kind of complicated.
It is a bit jargony, but the idea is, in long-term group work, some of the patterns people learned in their early family life, the patterns that might be causing trouble now, they can surface and be explored in the therapy group. Music, it gives people a safer way to try out new behaviors. Instead of just talking, they can, say, hit a drum if they're angry. And the group can then give feedback in a different kind of relational experience.
So it's like reliving those old patterns in a new and safer space. The source specifically mentions development of socializing techniques, Imitative behavior and interpersonal learning as key factors.
Yeah, we talked about those earlier. And then there are the existential factors. These are the big, unavoidable things that affect everyone, every group, like coming to terms with death and realizing we're responsible for our own lives no matter how close we get to others. Oh, and the therapist also points out that in these groups, they offer a variety of instruments and they let people choose what to play. No pressure. This gives them a sense of, agency and active choice. It's their musical experience.
So it's a pretty complex approach with lots of different layers when you're working with a group. Now, let's shift our attention to the physiological impact of music therapy. It seems like in the early days, researchers were really keen on understanding music's effects through a biological lens.
That's definitely true. A lot of doctors were big supporters of music therapy early on. And, it makes sense given how focused everyone was on medical stuff. They wanted music therapy to be taken seriously. So early research often looked for, those connections to the body. Arrington, for example, he summed up some of this early work. He pointed out that there are measurable changes when people listen to music. We're talking metabolism, breathing, heart rate, fatigue, attention, how active they are, muscle reflexes, even the electrical conductivity of the skin.
And the examples of John, in that individual session and the group, they seem to back up some of those findings.
Yeah, totally. Like, John was clearly more alert and focused during his session. And in the group, you could see people getting less tired as they made music. We all kind of get this intuitively, right? How music affects us physically. Some people can't even focus or work without it. Certain music can evoke some pretty intense physical reactions.
But it's not always the same for everyone, is it? That example of Arvo Pärt, that was pretty interesting.
Yeah, one person might find his music super calming, almost meditative, but someone else, they might get really irritated or even bored. It shows you how risky it is to assume everyone's going to react the same way to a piece of music. Ellis and Brighouse, their research showed that music could change breathing, but not always heart rate, which just goes to show how complex it is. And then Weidenfeller and Zimny, their work suggested that different types of music could affect emotional states by changing skin resistance, pointing to another physiological link, but one that's filtered through personal experience.
So it sounds like this early research, while important, also had some limitations.
It did. Often it just focused on those immediate one-time results and effects that didn't last very long. Plus, they often used a limited selection of pre-recorded classical music, which isn't really representative of, the interactive music making that's central to a lot of music therapy these days. And trying to study a therapist and client creating music together, that's way more complicated. So many factors you can't control. Plus, like we said before, separating physical and emotional responses, it's almost impossible. They're so intertwined.
That question Spender asks about those changes in breathing is a perfect example, right? Is it because of emotions or just our bodies syncing up with the music, kind of like when we march in step?
Exactly. Marching to a beat, it shows you something very basic about music. It's hard to resist syncing up our movements. So even though John was clearly paying attention to the rhythm, it's tough to say for sure that the music was the only cause of, his behavior and those physical changes. You got to consider that he was starting to, anticipate and expect things within the music. To really understand all this complexity, we'd need some seriously sophisticated research. Bringing in other fields, using advanced technology. But it's clear that something really fundamental is happening at this basic embodied level.
So we've covered the history, the practical stuff, and some of the biology. Let's get into those key concepts, the ideas that guide music therapy. Let's start with the ISO principle. What is that exactly?
The ISO principle, it was developed by Benenzon. It's all about sameness or matching. The idea is that the music the therapist starts with, its mood and tempo, it should match the client's emotional state or energy level. It's about establishing that initial connection. And the principle goes beyond just mood and tempo. It can also include matching the volume and rhythm to the client's presentation. The point is, you got to meet the client where they are, musically speaking.
Okay, so with John, in that individual session, the therapist would have been looking for that ISO relation.
Exactly. The therapist would have been trying out different moods, speeds, rhythms, searching for music that clicked with John's state, making him feel understood, connected through sound. And in that group session, the therapist had to be really observant, watching the group's initial musical expressions, their contributions, to find that group ISO, that shared musical element, that feeling that could bring everyone together.
Makes a lot of sense as a way to build trust, to create a therapeutic connection. And the force brings in Carl Jung's perspective, too. It sounds like there's a lot to unpack there.
There is. In 56, Jung, the famous psychiatrist, he meets Margaret Tilley, a concert pianist, and gets a taste of what we might call passive music therapy. Tilly played music for him. Now, unlike Freud, Jung actually knew and appreciated music, but at that point in his life, actively listening, it was tiring for him, even irritating. But here's the thing, he's quoted saying that music deals with this really deep archetypal stuff that even the performers, they might not fully grasp consciously. It's a deep subconscious connection.
So his resistance wasn't because he didn't care for music, it was almost the opposite.
That's how Tilly saw it. She realized Jung wasn't dismissing music. It was more like this deep respect, maybe even feeling a bit overwhelmed by music's power. When she played for him, she actually used what we now know as the ISO principle, choosing music that fit his mood and personality. She even considered those Jungian ideas like extrovert versus introvert, masculine versus feminine, thinking versus feeling. Jung, he got into it, even gave her hypothetical cases, for how she might use music in different situations.
So it sounds like Jung's early view of music therapy as kind of surface level changed after that experience with Tilly.
Yeah, he'd been skeptical at first, thought it was a bit sentimental, but Leslie Hitchcock, she suggests that what Jung actually said was more of a challenge, an invitation. She was saying that music therapists and psychoanalysts should work together to develop a deeper theory of music and its therapeutic potential. She brought up some interesting points about universal musical structures or archetypes and the links between music, symbols, metaphors, myths. She even suggested music could be part of every psychoanalysis. It's a call to dig deeper into music's psychological meaning within Jung's ideas.
It's fascinating how much deeper it goes than just, listening to something pleasant. Now, the discussion shifts to Eric Fromm's idea of a creative attitude in music therapy.
Right, from he emphasized active listening, being truly aware and authentically responding. Got to create space for a genuine encounter, being fully engaged and absorbed in the music. He uses this great example. A child totally fascinated with rolling a ball, how focused and joyful they are. Music therapy can offer that same kind of space for people of all ages to really listen, engage with that same level of attention, rediscovering that childlike wonder. It's about being present, actively involved in the sound.
So it's about being totally present, not just passively listening, but really participating.
Yeah.
And the course also mentions the idea of music therapy as a science of behavior. That sounds like a whole different approach.
It was a big deal in the 60s and 70s, especially in the US. This view saw music therapy as like behavioral modification, fitting in with the whole behaviorism movement in psychology. So music wasn't just something that provoked a response, it could also be a reward, reinforcing and maintaining specific behaviors.
So with John and the drumming, him hitting the drum and hearing the sound, that could be seen as a built-in reward to keep him drumming.
Yeah, exactly. That sensory feedback, the pleasure of making the sound, it can be a really powerful motivator. And of course, the therapist's encouragement, verbally or non-verbally, strengthens those behaviors even more. So all that behavior therapy talk, like rewards, tokens, goals, and reinforcement schedules, it could all be applied to music therapy.
And were there cases where this actually worked, like successful interventions using this approach?
Yeah, tons of research from that time shows music therapy based on behavior therapy principles working well. They were able to teach skills like reading, basic math, imitation. And they could reduce problem behaviors like aggression, repetitive movements, hyperactivity, things like token economy systems where clients got tokens for doing certain things musically, even using like rock music as a positive incentive. It was all part of this approach.
But there was criticism, right? And it eventually evolved.
For sure. People said it was too simplistic, focused only on what you could see and measure, neglecting the person's inner world, their emotions, intentions, choices, conscious experiences. And there were concerns about just addressing the symptoms instead of getting to the root cause of the behavior. Plus, relying on pre-recorded music in a lot of these models was seen as a problem because, it misses that live interactive element that's so important in a lot of music therapy today. The relationship between the therapist and the client when they're making music together, that's where the magic happens. So the field moved towards a more holistic and person-centered approach, one that considered the whole human experience.
So they learned some valuable things from that behavioral phase, but then moved towards a more integrated understanding of what therapy's all about. Now let's talk about those basic elements of sound and music that therapists use in their work.
Music therapists use the building blocks of sound: timbre or tone color, duration, how long a sound lasts, loudness, the intensity, and pitch, how high or low it is. Juliet Alvin, remember her? She emphasized knowing these elements inside and out, being able to pinpoint which one is most prominent in any musical experience. But it's important to remember that music's not just about these separate pieces, right? It's a whole tapestry of organized sounds, shaped by the context, the listener's experiences, their emotional state, cultural background, and of course, the musician's unique contribution.
All right, let's start with timbre, the tone color.
Timbre is often the first thing we notice that's different between sounds. Even babies can tell the difference. It's how we know it's a flute or a clarinet, even if they're playing the same note. We also have our personal preferences, and they can be pretty deep-seated, even primal. Timbre itself comes from the unique mix of the sound's fundamental tone and its overtones. Understanding timbre is key because it helps us attach meaning to sounds, to recognize them. Like, we instantly know the sound of a door slamming shut. Alvin talked about the therapeutic power of exploring vocal timbre, helping people find their own unique voice, their personal sound, even working with pre-speech sounds.
Next up, loudness.
Babies, they naturally make loud sounds, no holding back. The source even asks if us adults, by often trying to quiet kids down, are we maybe making them anxious or inhibited later on? In therapy, encouraging loud sounds can be a really important tool, especially for kids who have speech problems and might use loudness to communicate frustration or needs. For adults with depression, loud music making can sometimes be a way to let out anger, process suppressed emotions. But we can't just assume someone's emotional state based purely on how loud they play. For example, an autistic child might drum loudly to withdraw, while for someone else, it could be a release of tension, aggression, or even newfound confidence. And then on the flip side, soft sounds can create safety, intimacy. You can use them to calm things down, focus attention. Loudness can mean so many things. It all depends on the context.
Let's move on to pitch, how high or low a sound is.
Alvin tells this great story about a kid with serious disabilities who made the subtle foot movement when he heard the deep cello sounds. It shows how important it is to really pay attention, to notice even the smallest reactions to different pitches. Pitch is crucial not just in music, but also in verbal memory and intonation. So it could be linked to, how we understand and develop language. There's research that suggests certain frequencies, especially between 40 and 80 hertz, they can have a noticeable effect on the body. Lower frequencies tend to be felt more in the lower body, higher frequencies in the upper body. This understanding led to vibroacoustic therapy using those low-frequency vibrations. And it's had some amazing results with people who have profound disabilities, rheumatoid conditions, lung problems, even pain relief. Tony Wigram's early work showed that it could reduce muscle tone and spasms, improve breathing, and even increase vocalization, all while the person was relaxed. And there's more and more evidence that it might help with insomnia and stress. Controlled studies have even shown that adding specific low-frequency sound to music therapy, it can reduce muscle tension even more than music alone. So using pitch in a very specific, controlled way, it can have real therapeutic benefits.
And finally, duration and time in music.
How we perceive time, how long or short different sounds seem, it's really complex. It might even be tied to our internal rhythms, like our heartbeat. McLaughlin, he says that when our inner sense of time is messed up, it can show up as problems with how we experience tempo in music. Now, there's this debate about whether there's a universal natural tempo or tempo giusto, but the thing is, the length of a normal heartbeat is strikingly similar to the tempos that people often choose naturally when they're making music. This body-based tempo seems to be something universal. Across cultures, you see it in dance, folk music, the steady beat of rock music, even the tempos chosen by composers throughout history. And changing the tempo can directly affect us physically. Speeding things up, what's called an accelerando, often makes us feel excited, while slowing down, a retardando, can be calming. There's also this link between how we experience time and our health, whether we're sick or well. Ornstein, he has this cognitive view. He says our perception of time is a mental construction, linked to how much space our brain uses to process those sound events. Experiments have shown that we think things last longer when there are more sounds happening within that time. In rhythm, being able to anticipate what's coming is really important, and that's often created by using pauses and accents, which are variations in loudness or how long a sound lasts. For people with profound learning difficulties, understanding a regular pulse can be a real challenge. They might hear sounds as random, with big gaps between them. But rhythmic play can help them learn to predict, anticipate, and connect events in time. They build this temporal map of the future, as Spender calls it, which is so important for learning and interacting with the world.
Wow, these basic elements, they're really the therapist's toolkit. Now the sources start talking about melody and harmony and how they play a role in music therapy.
Research shows that most kids, around age 5, they start being able to keep a steady sense of tonality when they sing songs they know. Zanotti did this research, looking at how children respond to tonal and atonal music. He found that kids between 6 and 10, they prefer tonal music and are better at it, which makes sense because they're learning the typical Western musical system. But then around 12 or 13, they start to get more into atonal stuff. This is all important for music therapists, how they use dissonance and consonance with clients of different ages. The general pattern seems to be first, kids notice the overall shape of a melody and the general pitch. Then they get a sense of tonality, and finally, they can pick up on small changes in intervals.
The source specifically talks about the children's tune and the pentatonic scale.
Right. Nordoff and Robbins, they noticed this super simple, often three-note melody, and they called it the children's tune. They thought it was kind of archetypal, something you hear a lot in kids' games and songs. And the pentatonic scale, that's a scale that leaves out certain notes, the fourth and seventh of a major scale. It's found in tons of different cultures, and it's often considered pleasant, even by adults who aren't musically confident. It doesn't have any harsh, dissonant intervals, so it's popular in group therapy. They even make instruments that are tuned to the pentatonic scale, especially percussion, so people can explore melodies without making any, jarring sounds.
And what about musical modes? Do they play a role in melody and harmony in therapy?
Definitely. Each mode, like Ionian, which is the same as a major scale, or Aeolian, which is similar to a harmonic minor scale, they all have their own unique feel and characteristics based on how the whole and half steps are arranged and how they've been used.